Elites Exposed, Chapter 26 of the audio-visual book, Evolution, Mankind's Role in the Creation and Rise of Artificial Intelligence. As the United States of America, or its leaders, had become so enamored with war, it was not really surprising when America attacked Iran. Despite the lack of any real evidence of the threat that Iran supposedly posed, according to America's leaders, and despite the contradictory claims in regard to Iranian provocation, Trump acted on what many said was the behalf of Israel, or more specifically, Benjamin Netanyahu, when he directed the U.S. military to launch an attack that would kill what was arguably the most important spiritual leader in Iran, and possibly the Middle East. The irony being that this act made this spiritual leader a martyr, inadvertently giving this Ayatollah's death far greater meaning than his life alone could have. Other than helping this late Ayatollah transcend from being a mere man to becoming a nearly mythical being, there were other issues with America's attack on Iran. One very bad one had to be the lack of any plan past the initial missile strike. Though leaders from the U.S. claimed its actions as preemptive, an effort to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapon capabilities, or to end an authoritarian regime, or to stop Iran's ballistic missiles from hitting American targets, these arguments lacked credulity, as nothing seemed to indicate or even imply Iran's desire to develop nuclear weapons, nor that a majority of Iranians sought to overthrow their current leadership. As for the missiles that American leaders claimed were a threat to America, they only seemed to have enough range to be a threat to the American bases that surrounded Iran. And in regard to any desire for regime change, that was eventually denied as a stated goal by the Trump administration. The excuses for what became known as the Iranian-Israeli War dwindled, or funneled down to the same old and obvious reasons given for any modern conflict. In the case of this war, those reasons being control and power. As the war's impetus became more apparent, Americans became more reticent and disillusioned with their leadership, especially Trump, because it was becoming all too obvious that this conflict was initiated to distract from issues that were surfacing at home, issues like the Epstein files. The citizens of the United States of America began to hate their leaders as those same leaders sought to protect some of the most despicable and immoral people on the planet by bombing civilians in another country. The truly sad part was that, as disgusting as it was, such a strategy wasn't a complete surprise. After all, it had already been used as a means for Netanyahu to avoid the criminal charges he and his wife would inevitably face. For as long as Israel could be kept on a war footing, Bibi could avoid the trials he would undoubtedly have to endure, as well as the possible prison time to which he would probably be sentenced. And then there was a question of Trump doing the bidding of the Prime Minister of Israel. While denying such accusations, it was quite odd how Netanyahu's visits to the White House aligned with actions taken by the White House that benefited Israel but not America. Things like the cover-up of the Epstein files and the initiation of war with Iran lining up with those visits made the American public question whether its leadership was beholden to Israel. It was at this time that the American public found it increasingly difficult to ignore what was clearly a conflict of interests. How could the President of the United States be doing the bidding of his own people when he always seemed to be doing the bidding of a foreign nation? As for why Americans had allowed leadership to become so degraded as to have a president who lied more often than he spoke the truth, this would have to wait for future analysis. The speculation at the time, however, was that, as the saying goes, freedom is not free, or more aptly put, bad times lead to good leaders, and good times lead to bad leaders, something that anyone with half a brain could easily have seen if they were so inclined to correlate the upward and downward trends in American life with the quality of the leadership in America throughout the years. This is not to say that there were no good leaders, but rather to point out that with a preponderance of bad leaders, the actions of those few good leaders were muted. For Trump to consider himself a good leader, there had to be a long line of sycophants catering to his every need, including his mental and emotional needs. It must have been hard for him to believe that he was anything other than magnificent, when all indicators implied that he was in fact the best thing to ever happen to the United States of America, especially when an entire nation, or the plurality of that nation, voted to reinstate him as president. Even given the shortcomings of the political party that supposedly opposed Trump, perhaps a computer could someday model what life would have been like had America elected an inarticulate, nonsensical, seemingly inebriated dullard like Kamala Harris as president. this country and the world would be able to determine whether or not the United States would have attacked Iran, moving the globe closer to a third world war. As for there being the possibility of a good leadership in the United States at this time in its history, the author of this very audio-visual book always stated that such an occurrence would have been an impossibility because, as he argued over the years, corrupt at the top, corrupt all the way to the bottom. Meaning, if the highest office in the land, that being the presidency, is corrupt, there would have to be little to no way for that corruption not to persist throughout that society, or at least the leadership of that society. This would have to hold true, as for one to reach the heights of the presidency, all of those on the way to that lofty office would have to overlook all of the bad behavior, policies, and actions exhibited by such a candidate. And given that things like the ability of Congress to buy and sell stocks with a foreknowledge of laws that would be enacted, impacting those stocks, one could never argue for the integrity of that branch of government. For all intents and purposes, this behavior could not be described as anything other than insider trading, something that is considered illegal for everyone except those in Congress. Ridiculous! And if only insider trading was where the corruption ended, one would have to admit that such a society was a failure. But this, as we know, was not where America's leaders' malevolence ended. For as investigations into the Jeffrey Epstein files continued, new evidence popped up on an almost daily basis. Evidence that not only revealed the crimes and perpetrators of those crimes, but also exposed a cover-up that went to the highest levels of American leadership. The illicit and immoral activities being so prominent and prevalent that it began to feel as if there was a concerted effort to prematurely bring down the American empire and its people. For what greater crimes could a leader commit than to ignore the plight of his or her most vulnerable people, like the third of the nation that faced food insecurities, or starvation as it used to be known? What good leader could ignore the fact that, due to wealth inequality, 1 out of every 10 of their citizens was falling into poverty while living in the richest nation to ever exist on the planet? What good leader would ignore the fact that 50% of all bankruptcies were due to medical bills in the only healthcare system maintained by a first world nation that did not include universal healthcare? What healthy system could include an infrastructure that did not only not keep up with those infrastructures maintained by other nations, but ignored the degree to which it was degrading, while ignoring the fact that jobs could have been created to repair things like roads and bridges? What good modern nation has leaders that overlook the trafficking and abuse of children to the extent that it is willing to start wars as a means to distract the masses from such evil acts? As Donald Trump's legacy collapsed within the first half of his second term, Americans finally woke up to the fact that their nation's standing as the sole superpower on earth was not a given. They finally understood the importance of holding their leaders to a much higher standard than simply making money by any means possible or using people in any way they saw fit, including massacring them in pointless, useless, illicit, immoral, unjust wars. Thanks for joining me as I detail Earth's transition from a human-centric world to one dominated by mankind's own creations and descendants. To catch up, look back for Chapter 1, and to continue listening to this story, join us every Friday for a new installment.